Welcome, everyone. I am Dr. Sarah Davis with the Family Enterprise Center at Kennesaw State University. We're so glad that you have joined us today. So, at the Family Enterprise Center, our mission is to educate, support, and connect family businesses. And we create spaces where family business leaders can come together like this and learn from experts. And most excitingly, walk away with some practical insights that help to both strengthen your company and your legacy. So today's program is a great example of that, and we're going to talk about employee stock ownership plans, or ESOPs as they're frequently referred to. So for many family businesses, ESOPs can be a powerful tool to help ensure a smooth transition. It can help motivate and retain employees, and perhaps most importantly, it can help preserve the family legacy. But like any strategy, they require thoughtful planning and clear communication to get them right. And so we are very lucky to be joined today by Will Lee of Applied Economics, who brings this expertise and personal experience with helping family businesses explore and implement ESOPs. So thank you for being here today, Will.
Thank you, Sarah. And thank you for the everyone from the KSU team at the Family Enterprise Center. Let's jump right in. So on today's agenda, we will have a brief overview of applied economics and what we do. We'll get into what ESOPs are and some of the major features of the ESOPs. And then I think the meat of the presentation is really going to come down to some of these myths and misconceptions. I think a lot of people have a lot of misunderstandings around ESOPs. They've heard about them. They don't really know all the ins and outs of it, and we'll go through that. And then definitely want to mention some additional resources. If anybody has follow-up questions or is looking for some more educational content. All right, so Applied Economics, we're a boutique firm based in Atlanta, Georgia. However, we do work all over the United States, primarily in three areas: business valuation, investment banking, and an ESOP advisory. That kind of overlap a decent amount, and you'll see why in a little bit. So on the business valuation side, we don't need to get into all this. On the ESOP side, long story short, I will share this presentation with everyone because there's a lot on these first few slides that are really not necessary right now. Okay, here's a good one. This is some of the recent ESOP transactions that we've been a part of companies either establishing, selling, or terminating an ESOP if they had another great offer. That's what happened with Future State over here. They sold to Accenture, and all the employees had a great payout. So an ESOP, an employee stock ownership plan, is a way to sell your business that benefits the company, employees, and the selling business owners. It takes all three of those stakeholders into account when you're doing the transaction, and that's important. ESOPs really have three main features. The first one that I think business owners are going to be acutely attuned to, or it's an ownership transition tool. It allows you to sell your business either for a full 100% of it or a partial amount of it, whatever you decide. The employees are the beneficiary of that transaction, and the proceeds of that sale will over time accrue to their retirement account. One of the major features of an ESOP transaction relative to selling to a third party are the tax advantages. As we'll see later on in the presentation, a 100% S-Corp ESOP is going to be exempt from all federal and state taxes, most state taxes. On the flip side, if the selling shareholder decides to do a C-Corp structure, they can defer their taxes on the sale, hopefully indefinitely, with proper planning. And by the way, if anybody has any questions along the way, feel free to put them in the chat. And Sarah, if you see anybody raise their hand or do something in the chat, feel free to interrupt me and let me know, or anybody for that matter. An important thing to note is there at the bottom, the ESOP transaction needs to be a fully vetted and negotiated transaction between the corporate team, the sellers, and a trustee. It's important for the Department of Labor, who oversees ESOPs and the ERISA plans, that this is a transaction done at fair market value. That's one of the major downsides of an ESOP, is that the transaction has to be done at fair market value. And you're not going to get the strategic pricing you might with a sale to a third party. It's important to note, though, that the strategic premiums that you're seeing or hearing about in the marketplace are often as a result of the buyer already has an accounting department. They already have an HR department. So they're willing to overpay somewhat because they know that they're going to turn around and cut those jobs. So it makes the transaction purchase price look a little bit more affordable from their perspective. So one of the key benefits of an ESOP is that you're able to maintain a lot of the jobs. So here's some of the other key benefits of an ESOP plan. We touched a little bit on the tax efficiency. What we see a lot is that, family businesses, their entire, 90% of their net worth is wrapped up in the family business. And there's not a good way to unlock that liquidity without selling to a third party. And an ESOP allows them to do that and continue running the business, staying involved if they want to, in the day-to-day management of that business. One important component here that's not mentioned, that's particularly important for family businesses. A lot of family businesses don't want to saddle the Gen 2 and Gen 3 with a significant amount of debt to buy out the Gen 1. An ESOP would effectively allow that second generation or third generation to buy out and transition the family business, but put the debt obligation on the company rather than them personally. And that's an important feature of ESOPs. Some of you have seen this chart before. This is a couple years old already. This is the best and illustration I could find of it, but I think now there's like 6,400 ESOPs in the country. They're growing in popularity, but it's a slow, it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back with ESOPs. My coworker said it the best. The great thing about ESOPs is that they're flexible. The bad things about ESOPs is that they're flexible. And so what that does is create some complications and misunderstandings around them. The way an ESOP works, typically, and this is an example of a leveraged ESOP, the company is going to borrow money from a bank. They're going to use those proceeds to buy out the selling shareholder. And that's called the external loan. And that's the loan that matters. That's obviously when there's a third-party bank involved, they want to get repaid. Concurrent with that debt obligation, there's an internal loan where the company and the ESOP have an agreement that they're going to, buy stock from the company, and the ESOP is going to get the stock in exchange for that internal loan. The internal loan, we call it kind of funny money. It doesn't really matter. What happens is the company pays for the stock, and the ESOP sends that money right back. And so it doesn't really matter, but it's a mechanism that by executing it, it releases shares to the employees. And so it's historically, the bank loan might have 5 to 7 years to be repaid. The internal loan used to have a very similar time payback period. But what they found was that having such a short payback period released too many shares to the employees too quickly. And so employees in 5 to 7 years might be fully vested and own 100% of the company, and then they retire and the company's kind of doesn't have a workforce anymore. So what they've done over time is extended that internal loan to 20, 30, 40 years. And it's meant to be a long-term benefit plan. Here we'll see on the next slide that as that loan is repaid to the bank, the internal loan is also repaid, and that allocates stock to the employees. And you want that, again, to be a long-term benefit. So these two payback horizons are going to be different. When you're setting up an ESOP, they can be flexible to a fault. You really need to work with an advisor that's going to talk to you about various features of the ESOP. Do you want it to be a minority ESOP or control? What I mean by that is, is the ESOP going to buy 100% or something less than 51%? If you're going to do a C Corp tax strategy, the 1042, which we'll get into in a second, you need to sell at least 30% of the company's stock to be eligible for that. Financing, how are you going to finance the deal? Most banks that are in the ESOP business, they understand it's a leverage transaction and they're willing to lend up to a certain amount, but that amount typically won't be for 100% of the deal. You might get 2 or 3 turns of EBITDA if you're lucky, depending on the type of bank and the type of company you have. But the balance of that purchase price needs to be made up of seller notes typically, or some other tranche of debt, like mezzanine debt. You need to consider the S Corp or C Corp structure. You need to consider the board composition. And then some of the employee benefit levels, like how fast are you going to release shares, going back to that internal loan. So this is an example of an ESOP that we set up for a company that had different levels of salaried employees. And you can see over time that someone at a $50,000 salary after 10 years should have 10 times their salary in a retirement account. I mean, this obviously assumes the company's doing well, paying down their debt. But at different levels, you can see someone in the executive type C-suite at a $250,000 salary might have, over 2 million in their retirement account over time. So an ESOP is a great way for employees to put away money that may not always have, said another way, they're living paycheck to paycheck. We have a lot of ESOP-owned companies that have, that are in manufacturing space. And those employees are not able to save for retirement because they're just not thinking about it. And this is a great way to force that and create real savings for them in their retirement account. In addition to, benefiting the employees, of course, there's certain carve-outs for the management team that we like to implement. They're certainly optional. But every time we do an ESOP, we recommend a management incentive plan. And these are additional benefits, mainly for the management team, above and beyond the employee allocations that they're going to get. And typically they're done in the form of a stock appreciation right, a SAR. And a SAR is effectively, when they're typically issued at a very low value after the transaction's been done, when the equity value of the company has been squeezed because of all the debt associated with the ESOP transaction. And over time, let's say 1 to 3 years, those SARs are redeemed by the company for the incremental value that it's accrued to the equity. Basically, it's an extra bonus tied to their performance or just being a part of the company tied to their employment. And they can create some pretty substantial value for the management team. And after 1 or 3 years, when they're redeemed, they can be reissued. And then you set it up for another 3-year term. And so it's a great retention tool for some of your key employees that you want to make sure stay with the company long term. And then again, this is above and beyond their normal allocation that they're going to get in their retirement account. So what makes for a good ESOP candidate? It's the same thing that makes for, a good candidate in any sale. You want to make sure that they have, unused debt capacity, they're profitable, they've been around for a while. Some of the more nuanced things that are important for an ESOP transaction, typically we like to see at least 20 employees. That's because the ESOP plan, it needs to be a broad-based plan in order to satisfy some of the ERISA requirements. And when you start having less than 20 employees, if someone were to leave, it can kind of throw that broad-based plan into flux. And so a lot of that ownership might tilt too much into one party's favor. Again, it needs to be a broad-based plan. So that's why we'd like to see at least 20 employees. You can do an ESOP with less than 20 employees, especially as a C Corp. You can also consider some other forms of employee ownership, which we'll get into later in the additional resources. But an EOT, an employee-owned trust, might be a good alternative there if you don't have 20 employees. Weak ESOP candidates, that's the same things that you might consider for any transaction. Again, they're unprofitable, they have high volatile earnings, they have significant amount of debt already. So asset heavy or asset intensive businesses that already have significant debt may not have capacity for additional ESOP transaction debt, and therefore would not be a good candidate for a transaction. The other thing to think about, it's not on the slide here, but companies that are typically in high growth mode. So think, software companies, technology companies, they're not necessarily bad candidates, but they may want to consider just doing a small minority ESOP versus selling the whole thing. And I mean that because, in next year, the company may have a significantly different valuation from today or 3 years from now. So the selling shareholders may not want to sell everything now when it could significantly change next year. So let's get into some of the myths and misconceptions. Is there anything in the chat? So someone asked me to repeat the 10 times their salary. We'll go back to that real quick. So each year that the company or the employee is with the company, and you can set it up however you want. If they're a part-time employee that doesn't work, 6 months or 1,000 hours or whatever metric you want to have, as long as it's applied consistently throughout the workforce, that can be the gating issue whether they receive shares of the ESOP. And so let's say you have someone that's worked 2,000 hours or whatever you decide. At the end of the year, they're going to get they're going to be allocated shares. And those shares are going to have a value that's going to be determined by a third-party valuation firm. And I guess the good way to describe it is like buying a house. When you buy a house, let's say the value of the house doesn't go up or down, it stays consistent. But over time, you pay down the mortgage. That's going to increase the value of the equity just by its very nature. And so even if the company doesn't continue to do well, the shares are going to accrue in value. They're going to increase in value. Now, that's just a steady state case. Most of the time, what we see is that there's a lot of buy-in from the employees, and there's an ownership culture that's created. And the company not only pays down the debt, but they also do really well and start increasing in value on top of the pay down of debt. And so over time, again, we're seeing companies that have significant retirement savings as a result of this. Did I answer that question? Okay, great. One thing to note here is again, they're flexible, but sometimes they're flexible to a fault. We had a situation where we had a company that we were installing an ESOP for, and they had a few employees that were with them forever, and they wanted to make sure that they were taken care of first and foremost. And again, it needs to be a broad-based plan that's applied consistently throughout the workforce. However, we was able to say, okay, if you've been here for 2 years, 4 years, whatever, that's time served, and your shares are fully vested. So something to consider is the vesting, similar with a profit sharing plan, or some people have a 401k plan where it may not be fully vested. You can do the same thing with an ESOP shares, where they might vest over a period of time. But if you want to have, time served, so to speak, where your long-term employees, you can have them fully vested on day one. But again, that needs to be applied from top to bottom. You can't pick and choose which employees you want to make that apply to. All right. So myths and misconceptions. I don't have the right type of company for an ESOP. All right. The great thing about an ESOP is that they can be applied in almost any industry. This is data from the NCEO, which is the National Center for Employee Ownership. And these numbers represent percentages of the overall universe of ESOPs. So the vast majority of ESOPs are in manufacturing, 21%. But you can see that they're in almost every industry you can think of. So I don't think industry really matters. What you need to consider is that if you're the right type of corporate structure, most of the companies that come to us are currently an LLC. And at that point, your advisor needs to work with you on whether it makes sense to become a C Corp ESOP or an S Corp ESOP. And the vast majority of ESOPs are S corps, about 2/3, simply because it's the simplest transaction. I believe I mentioned that, and ESOPs are effectively a qualified retirement plan under ERISA. And S corp is a pass-through entity for income tax purposes. So the tax obligation of an ESOP passes through to the owner. The owner of an S corp is a qualified retirement plan that doesn't pay taxes. So an S corp ESOP is not going to pay federal or most state income taxes. We find that a lot of business owners prefer an S corp structure because the company is tax-free going forward. That allows them to pay down their seller notes even faster. So again, the bank's going to get paid down quickly. And if they have additional excess cash flow that's not being paid to Uncle Sam, they can use that to pay down the debt from the transaction faster. For family businesses, this is important. As a C corp, you can sell the company to an ESOP, and under 1042, you can elect to defer your taxes from that sale. And with the proper planning, you can defer it indefinitely. And again, I think I mentioned at the top of the presentation, you have to sell at least 30% of the company's stock to qualify for that. But for family-owned businesses that have second and third generation of employees working in the business, you're not able to take advantage of 1042. So that's something to consider as a family-owned business. I think the IRS says that you're already getting a significant tax benefit by taking advantage of 1042. So therefore, they don't want the second and third generation family members to also get their cake and eat it too within the ESOP. So you can be a family-owned business and do a C corp and do 1042 and defer taxes indefinitely. And you can continue to have your second, third generation work in the business. They're just not going to get ESOP stock in that allocation every year. I got another question that I cannot see. Okay. So again, the vast majority of our clients choose S corp, but we do have some clients that have chosen C corp status. The best analogy for a 1042 exchange is like a 1038, 1036? What you do with your house when you sell it and you immediately buy another house, you're able to defer that tax. Same thing here. You have qualified replacement property, and that's all you're doing to avoid the tax there. But you need to work with an appropriate advisor to make that happen. This is a big one with family businesses. If I sold to an ESOP, I would lose control and have to divulge sensitive information to all my employees. I think there's a big concern with ESOP transactions that once everyone becomes an owner and they have this owner culture and owner mentality, everyone's going to be knocking on their door to see the financials, to make decisions on, the business's, future. And it doesn't quite work like that. When you sell to an ESOP, you're selling to a trustee as the owner of record. The trustee is a single shareholder, and they're kind of holding the shares on behalf of the employees. We'll get into the day-to-day operations of an ESOP-owned company, but you're not going to have employees meaningfully getting involved in the day-to-day operations of the company. That's one of the benefits of an ESOP transaction is you can continue to control and run the business post-transaction, as opposed to a sale to a third party or private equity where they're going to be kind of dictating what you're doing day-to-day. You're not going to have that with an ESOP. So again, after an ESOP transaction, the company operations are going to remain unchanged. Management's going to stay intact. And importantly, employees are going to keep their jobs. You will have, if you sell to, 51% to an ESOP that has, the trustee is going to typically, they're going to request to establish a board of directors if you haven't already established it. The selling shareholder can be the chairman, the CFO can be, on the board as well, however you want to structure it. But typically the trustee will ask that you have at least one independent board member. And that board member, the independent one, it on paper is going to look like the trustee selected them and chose them and put them on the board. But what happens in reality is the trustee doesn't really know manufacturing, they know how to run an ESOP. And so they're going to ask you if you have any recommendations. It's a great way to further your corporate governance. We had a construction company that we were to recommend a board member to that was able to provide them not only additional advice on ESOPs, because this other independent board member was also an ESOP owned company. They were also in the construction business and they were to generate more business for our client. So it was a win-win. Let's see, corporate governance typically shows, okay, this is easier said than done, but corporate governance is typically enhanced once an ESOP is established. Studies show that companies with good corporate governance typically outperform those without it. That makes sense. But an ESOP kind of forces everyone to have good corporate governance because you have an independent trustee monitoring the board. The board is going to have an independent board member, and it kind of goes without saying that typically those companies outperform their peers. 1031 exchange. Thank you, Reggie. ESOPs are too expensive to set up and maintain. I don't have a good slide on the actual transaction, but we'll get into the day-to-day ESOPs in a second. But in general, ESOPs are about half of it expensive to set up compared to a typical third-party sale. In an ESOP transaction, you are going to have lawyers, you're going to have a trustee, you're going to have a valuation firm. You should have some sort of investment banker quarterbacking the deal. But all in, those expenses should be about half of what it costs to go to market through a traditional M&A sell-side role. The reason for that is, we do both at Applied Economics, investment banking and ESOP advisory. When we're doing an investment banking role, we have to go out there and find a buyer, and the buyer may get cold feet and walk away. And so you have that risk of closing, and that risk of closing should compensate an advisor accordingly. However, in an ESOP, the risk of closing goes away substantially because the selling shareholder kind of controls the flow and pace of the transaction. And a lot of the unknowns are known at the front when you do your feasibility study. So our fees are significantly less under an ESOP structure. Now, once you become an ESOP, what does that look like? You are required to have some ongoing advisors involved. You're typically going to have an ESOP trustee, an annual valuation firm, and a TPA. And all in, those costs are going to be around $40,000. So that is something to consider if you're contemplating an ESOP. The ESOP trustee, I think we touched a little bit on that. Their job is to make sure that the beneficiaries of the trust are not being taken advantage of. And so they might sit on a quarterly management meeting. They're not going to dictate how you run your business, but they might just want to hear what you have to say. They might recommend an independent board member, and they're going to be looking after the employees. The annual valuation firm, again, when those shares are released on an annual basis, they need to have a value attached to them. And the valuation firm, Department of Labor requires a valuation firm to set that value every year. Some companies, very large ones, typically they might do twice a year, but what we see most often is an annual valuation. And then the TPA, that person or that firm is in charge of kind of knowing who owns what. With an ESOP, it gets very convoluted very quickly. You might have a lot, some ESOPs have hundreds and hundreds of employees, and you need to kind of have someone looking over everyone's shoulder, making sure everyone knows who owns what. And they're also in charge of delivering statements to everyone that shows what their year-end values are. I guess it's important to note here that the employees, what they're shown is typically a statement that shows how many shares they have, how many shares they've been allocated, and what the value of those shares are currently. They're not shown the full valuation. They're not shown the financials of the business. They're not shown, the corporate minutes of any, management meetings. The information rights are significantly limited for employees of an ESOP-owned company. So we touched a little bit on the fact that when you sell to an ESOP, they are by law prohibited from paying more than fair market value. And that's true. That is one of the downsides of an ESOP, is that there are limitations on the sales price, but it's fair market value. There's a range of reasonableness. And I think a lot of people can agree that it's some part art, part science, and there's no exact number for depending on what industry you're in and what kind of company you are, how many employees you have. There's no formula. Some of the companies that we talk to say, well, our value is AR times 2 plus inventory, and there's none of that. It's a range of reasonableness that two parties can agree on and negotiate. In the next slide, I'm going to give you an example of a company that we sold to an ESOP for $30 million. No, hang on, it's the following slide, but something to consider when you're selling to an ESOP is not only is it the purchase price that you're getting, but it's also the interest on the seller notes, the warrants, and other ongoing benefits like your ESOP allocation, your salary, maybe board fees, if you establish, quarterly board fees or semi-annual board fees. And all those can accrue in value to the selling shareholders, and they need to be considered when comparing to a traditional third-party sale. Warrants, we need to hit a little bit on that. We talked a little bit about how an ESOP is financed. It's part bank debt and part seller note. Because those seller notes are typically subordinated to the bank debt, they should have a higher rate of interest because they're not first in line. And that higher rate of interest might be 15%. Who knows? It's going to be significantly higher than you would get from a bank loan. But that creates additional stress on the company's cash flows. So what most companies do, in exchange for reducing the seller interest rate down to something manageable for the company, they're given warrants. Warrants are effectively stock options on the business. So they're issued at a low value after the transaction. And once the bank debt typically has been fully paid off, the warrants can be redeemed. And again, it allows you to have a second bite of the apple. So think of it, again, this transaction we handed up for $30 million. The company, we went back and forth with the trustee team. We landed on $30 million for the value of the firm. We'll come back to this slide in a second. I want you to see that the purchase price came in the form of cash from the bank, seller notes, interest on the notes, warrant coverage. We negotiated 20%. And that $30 million number ultimately accrued to our seller at $43 million. So there's some additional benefits above and beyond just the negotiated share price. And then what's not shown here, this was based on, so we determined that the selling shareholder wanted to continue working for 5 years. We illustrated what it would look like for him over a 10-year period. And because he's the CEO of the company, he has one of the higher salaries. He's going to be allocated some of the higher or more stock of the ESOP. And over a 10-year period, that his stock allocation is going to be an additional $500,000 just by continuing to be an employee of the company. I'm going to go back to the warrants because they're an important piece of it. Again, the warrants are issued in connection with a reduction in the seller interest rate, and they're like a stock option. They're not going to have a lot of value at the beginning because the equity value, again, just like the SARs, are de minimis. But over time, as the company pays down the debt and hopefully increases their overall value in general, those warrants are going to have significant value. One thing that we like to recommend is that given the fact that they don't have a lot of value at the beginning, that's a great time to give them to your grandchildren, to a charity, or not charity, we won't do that, but some sort of estate planning where you want to give something with low value that's is going to have significant value down the road. So it's a great estate planning tool, those warrants. All right, that is it for my presentation. I want to leave you guys with some additional resources. The two big employee ownership associations in the United States are the NCEO and the ESOP Association. There's also the Employee Owner Expansion Network, which has a number of different states, including Georgia, I think Marie Davis is still with us here. And she runs the Georgia Center, and you may still run the Missouri one. I'm not sure if they got you working double or overtime. But these are great resources if you want to learn more about employee ownership and what it can do for your firm. And then the last thing I'll leave you with is some of these pictures that we have from some of these are our clients, some other ones are not. But this is, typically when the selling shareholder, brings all the employees in and says, I've sold the company, and there's a big gasp. And then he says, well, I've sold it to you guys, and you guys are going to be the beneficiaries of this firm going forward. There on after, there's this, it takes a little bit, but you do have an employee ownership culture that's created. And I love this picture in the bottom right. That's from a vesting ceremony. That at that point, that employee was fully vested. And so he had a nice gold vest. But it really can change the whole mentality of a business, where employees are, no longer, you know, wasting, if you have a lot of, heavy intensive assets or equipment, they're treating it better. They're thinking about if they really need this particular expense or not, because they see it in their statement that they get every year at the bottom line on the value of their shares. So, Sarah, I will stop there. That's it for the presentation. There probably are going to be some questions. I think you're on mute, Sarah.
Oh, thank you. I feel like I learned a good bit. I don't think I had considered the option of doing a partial ESOP, and your explanation of being in kind of that tech industry really makes sense. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, no, the partial ESOP is something we see a lot with family businesses where maybe the second generation, third generation wants to maintain 51%, but the first generation needs liquidity. I mean, they built this great asset, but it's not liquid. So an ESOP would
Hmm.
allow them to sell a portion of the business and let the second or third generation retain ownership. Now, on the flip side, we also see family businesses that do 100% and still have second, third, fourth generation involved.
Hmm. That's such an interesting approach because so often we see this conversation where the first generation has built up this business and they want to retire because who doesn't want to retire one day? But then the second generation kind of expects to be gifted the business,
Hmm.
and the first generation can't go forward and retire because all of their money is in the business. And so I feel like there's always a little bit of tension there, trying to identify ways to finance the first generation leaving without causing the second generation to go bankrupt. Like,
For
not
sure.
everyone just has $30 million in their back pocket to buy out their parents. So having that option, it's it makes sense. You don't necessarily have to go get an SBA loan or do owner financing or forego retirement. You can sell to the people that have been there for you the whole time.
Yeah, exactly. And then a lot of individuals like myself, we don't have the collateral for a $30 million loan,
Yeah.
but the company does.
Yes.
And you can put that debt obligation on the company and let
Yeah.
let the company buy out the, Gen 1.
How long would you say the planning process is before going forth and doing all of the paperwork to make this a reality?
Sure. So, like I said, compared to a traditional M&A, the ESOPs are much faster. You can get a plan done. The fastest I've ever seen is probably 3 months.
Oh.
But that's when we had a known objective because again, they're flexible. And so what we like to do is we work with our clients to say, well, what would it look like if you had 30% warrants or 25% warrants and you had this interest rate or that? And we go through scenarios and we look at what it looks like to them in 10 years, what it looks like to their management team in 10 years, and what it looks like to the typical employee. And so those iterations take time. But if we
Hmm.
didn't have that and we didn't have a bank involved, we can get something done in 3 months. Most transactions are 6 months.
That's pretty quick. We often advise that you start succession planning years in advance because there's so many nuances that you may not have thought about, but being able to do this in 6 months is pretty impressive.
Yeah, it's great. So there was a question in the chat about the management incentive plan. That There's no defined roles there. Basically, the trustee wants to make sure that there's a team of qualified individuals that can maintain the business if the selling shareholder were to leave. And so we've seen a MIP plan a management incentive plan is a broad term, but the SARs are what we were talking about. The SARs are given to key employees, and there's no defined roles for those. We've had them and given to a non-equity CEO. We've had them given to what their number one salesperson. We've had them given to just like a general manager that would be kind of knew the business inside and out. There's no defined roles. Typically, the overall equity portion that's assigned to SARs is probably 5 to 10% of the overall equity. Again, they're synthetic equity, so it doesn't really count. If you sell 100% of the business, we're still going to carve out what would be implied 5 to 10% for the management team.
Hey, Will, this is Reggie. How you doing?
Hey, Reggie.
Just had a quick question. How often, enjoyed the presentation, by the way. I'm a little new to the ESOP world, so I'm learning a lot. How often do you see if a company is performing well and it's showing that it's able to meet all its obligations? How often do you see, or do you even see the banks that maybe originally helped? Do you see them kind of stay involved and maybe refinance some seller notes or
Yeah,
something
that's a
and
great question.
kind of
So
get the seller paid a little faster, maybe?
yeah, we see that every time. That's a great question. So for those that are not as familiar with the ESOP world, typically you'll have a bank finance that'll do the first tranche. So you'll have some cash at closing, and that bank loan might be 3 to 5 years. And then the balance of that purchase price is made up from seller notes that might be, 5 to 10 years. And so the seller is thinking, oh my God, I'm not going to get all my money for 10 years. But what happens in reality is the bank's typically paid in 3 years, especially if they're a S Corp and they have additional cash flow from not paying taxes. Once the bank is paid off, typically the company will go back to the same bank and exchange, they'll reborrow money to take out the seller note. So the seller might get fully paid up in 3 to 5 years versus that 10-year horizon. So banks typically the banks that understand ESOPs, that's exactly why they want to be in the business, is because there's a reloading feature and they can continue to make money on their interest. Hopefully, did that answer the question, Reggie?
Absolutely, yeah. Thanks, Will. Appreciate it.
Looks like Marie has a question.
Hey, I just wanted to thank Will for having us on that information list. But I think what's really important to know about ESOPs is how they are so complex and they're hard to deal with, but they are so worth it. And that's why you need professionals like Will and people like us who know which banks know how to deal with it and can help you, and the National Center and the ESOP Association walk with you every step of the way forever. And something that is incredibly complicated becomes the most rewarding thing a company could ever do. So shout out to Will for being one of those people who really knows this stuff and loves both sides of the business. And
Oh, thank you, Marie.
well, I've seen you in action. I know it's true. So Will would never try to talk someone into or out of something that wasn't worthwhile for them. That I'm sure of.
No, the last thing you want is an ESOP to fail. So again, those feasibility studies that we do to determine if it's right for a company, they really need to take a long-term view and see if can the company cash flow this deal? What is it going to mean to the employees? That's, a key component of a person considering an ESOP is typically they're a benevolent owner and they want to take care of their employees. So they're going to want to make sure that they actually are seeing a benefit down the road. I'll say if the selling shareholder wants max dollar, doesn't care about legacy, doesn't care about potential job loss, then they need to sell to a strategic competitor. But an ESOP is probably not the right fit for them.
How often would you say people come to you to talk about ESOPs and then you identify that it's not right for them? Is that frequent?
Yeah, it happens from time to time. I mean, they're just not a good fit size-wise, or we can recommend other structures like an employee-owned trust. Or the goals of the selling family is not aligned with, being an ESOP. They want to get out. The second generation is really just tired of it. And so then we might recommend going to the more traditional sell side role. So there's this thing called a feasibility study that I've mentioned a few times. That's an analysis. We do things in phases. The first phase is a feasibility study to determine everything we talked about, employee benefits, what it means to selling shareholders. What is that going to look like after the transaction and in 10 years from now? It's not necessarily to determine if an ESOP is feasible. We'll know that from our first conversation, whether it makes sense or not. The feasibility structure is really just it creates a guideline for us to follow during the transaction in phase 2. Well, I'm not sure if there's any other questions. I don't see any other hands. Oh, just saw a thumbs up from Reggie. Cool.
All right. Well, if there are no other questions right now, but you have a question later, Will, how can people get a hold of you?
Yes, so you can find me at appliedecon.com. I will also share this presentation with my contact information in the back with everybody. So you'll have a copy of that.
Great.
And feel free to reach out. We don't charge for any conversations or multiple conversations. We understand that in this line of work, it's a long sales cycle. And so I've been talking to clients 2 years ago that are just now coming to determine that a feasibility study would be the right next step.
See, that's the number I was looking for, not 6 months. This is a 2-year conversation.
Oh, it is. It can be, because it's a lot to take in.
Yeah. Especially if you're new to the ESOP world and you hadn't really considered it before. There's a lot to take in.
Mhm.
All right. Well, thank you, Will. Thank you, everyone, for coming and joining in on this discussion. This was great. And this is just one of the many ways that the center works to provide education, support, and connection for family businesses across Georgia. So we hope that you come to another program. You can find all of them on our website at familyenterprisecenter.com. But until then, hope you all have a great day. We look forward to seeing you again in the future.
Thank you, Sarah. Thanks, everyone.